So Divya, it's a great pleasure to have you here as well, and welcome you to this kind of inspirational nights that we have here at Way Media. I'd love to know more about your work on neuroscience and medicine, and I'm building on what Monique was talking about, how this connects with other technologies that are also growing very rapidly, and how you see these beautiful combinations that could come up in the future.
So my origin was in neuroscience. I got a PhD in visual neuroscience, but I came to neuroscience as a lot of people who become neuroscientists come to this field, which is we wanted to understand this hard problem of human consciousness. What makes us us? Where does it end? Do animals possess consciousness too? And if we were to build sufficiently complex machines at some point, would they begin to express this thing that we recognize as consciousness? So when I was getting my MD and choosing to pick a specialization, I chose one that a lot of people would think, oh, that doesn't make sense because you're a neuroscientist, and that was anesthesia. The reason I did that was because with the drugs I use, I get to manipulate human consciousness for a living. So I take away people's consciousness, I restore it, but the thing that I add, the layer that I add, is I actually measure all their brains through the process. And I use that to actually map neural networks as they move through these different states. And one of the things I do is I write new algorithms to actually help to capture those changes. Some of them are linear, the way our brains are built to think. So 1 + 1 = 2. But we've been using a lot of nonlinear analyses to try and understand how the brain changes state, because it's probably a nonlinear process. So we've been looking at something sort of akin to chaos theory. So we've been looking at chaotic attractors and how the brain forms new attractors as it moves from one state to the next. And I also work with a lot of neuroscientists who are physicians in other fields in which consciousness is disrupted, like sleep or coma or seizures. And we look to see what those brains have in common, what are similar and what are different, so that we can come up with usable definitions. And then ultimately, I think about how these things interface with the other things that we're doing, like implanting machines and devices into humans, into their brains, and how as we start to augment humans and basically create cyborgs, what that implication is for the evolution of human consciousness.
That's super interesting. How do you see that being applied into real life? I mean, like, businesses. I mean, of course, there are like beauty side of this and a lot of positive and very interesting applications, but I also see a lot of like manipulation and a possibility to convince people to do certain things that maybe they were not actually intended to do. So how do you see this being actually applied in real life and in businesses?
So one of the things that when companies come to me for help that they ask me about is neuromarketing. How can I read someone's brain and actually market to them and discover what their reactions are, the reactions they don't even know they have, to my product, to my brand, to whatever it is. So I help them sort of understand some of these things, but there is another side to this. So for instance, all the biometric data that you give up to the world, whether it's through Google, Alexa, Siri, wherever you're sending your data, Facebook, it has a consequence, and we're just discovering the last few years that, for instance, you can use the electroencephalogram, which is the electrical recording of your brain, which we used to think was very noisy and messy and didn't necessarily have that much individual information in it. Turns out you can actually use it as a fingerprint. Mm-hmm. And they were starting with recordings that were what we call very high density, lots of electrodes all over the head. Well, that's not that useful, so we probably can't hack everyone's brain sitting here. But I'm here to tell you, you can now put like a Muse device, a neuro wearable that you can buy on Amazon for a couple of $100 US, and 3 or 4 leads is enough to actually identify your brain. And then more studies are coming out showing that you can hack people's passwords as they type them in, that you can run machine learning on existing databases of people with mental illness, for instance, alcoholism or schizophrenia, come up with a classifier and then reapply it to new brains. And you can detect these sorts of things in those brains. Sometimes these people aren't even expressing those disease states, for instance, addiction, but it could be used against them. So there is a dark side to all of this, but it's not so dark if we understand, where this technology can be used. And so I've had a lot of people, so I work with Monique at Singularity, and for instance, when we're training a bunch of executives, many of them will raise their hands during Q&A and say, so what are you doing about all those ethical applications? And I said, I can only do so much. You're the people, you're all sitting here, you're from all over the world, you have money, power, influence. You need to be using all of that influence for good. And now that you understand what's happening, you need to work with others, you need to talk to governments, you need to talk to regulatory agencies, and you need to talk amongst yourselves, because this isn't something I get to pick and legislate, right? Gene editing. Right? We've been forming commissions because people are realizing how scary it is to edit the code of life at the level of human embryos. First of all, people keep violating these edicts, right, that people make. So that Chinese researcher in November of last year personally announced, oh, I've decided to edit the embryos of within a dish for IVF, and I reimplanted them, by the way. No ethical conversation about that. He's edited the human germline. We don't even know what the outcome is going to be for those two babies. So another committee was hurriedly convened. But do you think that those scientists who helped develop CRISPR, one of whom used to be a grad student in the lab I did my postdoctoral work in, do you really think those people have any control? They can put some words out into the world, they can help to educate, but this is a global citizen problem. Yeah. So